Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Sword of Kahless, which is episode 8 of season 4 of Star Trek DS9. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of DS9 one episode at a time. In this video I cover the 4th season episode, The Sword of Kahless. So the Sword of Kahless is the episode in which Kor comes to the station to see Dax, and he meets Worf and hits it off with him and invites him to go on a quest to find this ancient believed lost artifact, the Sword of Kahless. And so they agree and they go to the Gamma Quadrant where they find this sword. However, they are intercepted by Terrell, the illegitimate son of Duras, who Worf had faced before, and they attack them. And Worf barely gets away. Worf and the team, I should say. They barely get away, but Terrell has put a dampening field on their communications, so they have to struggle to find a way to the surface. In the meantime, Kor and Worf start going mad with greed, all wanting the sword for themselves, and they try to kill each other until Dax shoots them both. And they manage to defeat Terrell, and Dax convinces him to, phaser point I should say, convinces him to lower the dampening field. So they get away, and Worf and Kor, apparently off screen, had decided that the sword is too tempting and will drive a wedge between the Empire, just like it drove a wedge between the two of them. And so they decide to beam it off into space. So, starting with my personal experience with this episode, as I tend to do. I did watch this episode when it first came out, but I was barely paying any attention to it. I was with my girlfriend at the time, and, we were just, talking and stuff and hanging out, and weren't really paying that much attention to the episode. And several years later, when I finally saw it on reruns, I was like, yeah, I didn't miss anything. I can see why I wasn't that interested in paying attention to it. So apparently, this was the first episode written with Worf in mind. Because apparently a lot of the early Season 4 episodes were already written before the producers forced Worf into the show and made Worf be a part of the show. So then they wrote Way of the Warrior. And so they had to sort of rewrite some of the episodes to put Worf in it. Now you can tell with episodes like The Visitor, which he barely appears in. He just has 1 or 2 lines of dialogue, and Little Green Men as well. But there's Hippocratic Oath, where he has an entire B plot to himself. So that had to be rewritten at the last second. Starship Down, I thought he had quite an important role. He had his whole storyline to himself amongst all these other storylines, and it seems like if the episode might have been very different if they didn't have Worf there. So it seems like that episode was rewritten a lot. However, that's, the one that aired right before this one, so it would have been the one they would have the most time to work on, if indeed that was the last episode written before, they knew Worf would be part of the show. So I guess I can see that they'd have enough time to rework. It does make me wonder what it would have been like without Worf. But this apparently was the first episode that they had Worf in mind. It's definitely, other than The Way of the Warrior, it's the first Worf-centric episode that focuses on him. And, I would go as far to say that this is kind of a TNG episode more than it is a DS9 episode. It references TNG a lot. It references the Rightful Heir a lot. It also references Redemption. And it's focused mainly on Worf, who is, a TNG character who just joined DS9. And I think the only thing that makes this a D Space Nine episode is Dax. Dax being there. Not Core, because Core was an original series character who appeared in one episode of the original series and one episode of D Space Nine before this. And so he's not a D Space Nine character. So he doesn't make this episode D Space Nine. Dax is the only thing. And she doesn't have that huge of a role. It's more focused on Worf than Core, so it's not really a Deep Space Nine episode as far as I'm concerned. It's more of like and plus the way it feels more like a TNG episode. And it's wrapping up TNG storylines. It does have a Lethian in it that was introduced in Deep Space Nine, but I don't know. It's one of the least Deep Space Nine episodes I've seen so far. And so the other thing is, I had assumed that this episode was written by Ronald D. Moore since he was the Klingon guy, he was the Worf guy. But when I found out it wasn't written by Ronald D. Moore, it was actually written by Hans Bimler, who was on TNG for the second season. I think at the moment he's just a freelance. He doesn't become part of the DS9 writing staff until season 6 after Robert Hewitt Wolf leaves. So at this point I think he's just a freelancer that probably Ira got because he knew him from working on TNG with him in season 3. But anyway, so Hans Bindler wrote this episode, and so did Renee Echevarria was involved in this episode, who also of course was on TNG for the last couple seasons. And the thing with that is, I should have realized that it wasn't Ronald D. Moore, because Worf is totally out of character. I'm sorry. He is out of character in this episode, and Ronald D. Moore would know better, would know how to write for him better. I know Renee Echevarria should know better because he wrote for him in the final 2 seasons, but even then, usually it was Ronald D. Moore who wrote all the Worf episodes. And the thing is, it's funny, I watched this review recently, as I tend to watch reviews after I watch the episode before I record my review, and I watched this review that said that they really didn't like the first half of the episode, but they loved the second half. And I found that very funny, because I feel the exact opposite. I like the first half was fine. That was definitely more interesting. But the second half is when it just turns into a cliche Gold Fever storyline at the expense of being consistent with the characters. Now with Core, I don't have that big of a deal because he only appeared in 2 episodes before this, so he doesn't really have that much of an established character. But Worf, this is insanely out of his character and very contrived writing. And and it's funny because that same review also said, oh, this is totally in character for Worf. I could see Worf behaving this way. I'm like, wow, did we watch the same episode? Worf is completely and totally out of character. He's been established as someone who isn't in it for personal glory. He's in it he actually cares about the betterment of the Empire. He actually cares, and he's usually really good at sharing the spotlight. He never needs to be in the spotlight and needs to take credit, and is usually humble of sharing sharing credit for his accomplishments. In fact, this is very much proven, and I know this hasn't happened yet, but it's reinforced in the 7th season, spoilers for that, when Worf kills Gowron, and he has the opportunity to become the Emperor, or not the Emperor, the Chancellor, or whatever you call it. He has the opportunity to become the leader of the Klingon Empire, and they even, Martok puts the cloak on him, and everyone starts chanting, Worf, Worf, Worf. And so, if that episode was consistent with this shitty episode, Worf would have been like, yes, I'm the Chancellor, I'm going to rule the Empire. But of course that's not what he did, because that episode was written by Ronald D. Moore, and it was more consistent with Worf's actual character, who would say, no, I am not the one to lead the Empire, it actually should be Martok. And that one was way more consistent with this character. So now, I know what this episode's trying to say. It's trying to say, it's the typical Gold Fever storyline. It's trying to say, the sword is this, they're corrupt over it and they become all greedy over the sword. Even Worf, who's like a good person who normally doesn't want power, but the sword has corrupted him. Bullshit. In fact, this is so much bullshit that apparently a large portion of the fan base, when this episode first came out, that were online was a very different thing in the 90s, because not many people were online, mostly nerds, which is why Star Trek was so huge as an online thing. But anyway, there was a huge portion of the fan base who thought that the sword had some sort of technical power, or it was emitting some sort of maybe telepathic or technical jargon that was making them go mad and causing them to go insane, which is why they had to get rid of the sword. Now, Hans Bimler and Renee Echevarria were apparently very baffled and kind of upset by this interpretation, because they was like, no, of course there's no technical thing. Like, how could you think that? And I can answer that question for you, how they could think that. Because Worf's acting totally out of character. What these fans are actually doing is trying to come up with headcanon or sort of, make explanations or excuses for what is very clearly bad writing. And it's funny because, and I was watching this review from this other guy who still is under that impression, still is like, clearly this is some technical thing, I don't care what the writers say. He even put forth like, whenever something like this happens, where the writers intend something very different with the audience, there's several different possibilities. It could be just bad writing, or it could just be, maybe the people who filmed the episode, like the actors and everything, interpreted differently than what the writers intended, and he attributed that to the episode. Wrong. The first option is the one. Bad writing. That is why. Because Worf should not be acting like this. This goes totally 100% against his character, and that's what fans picked up with. But instead of just acknowledging or identifying what it actually is, which is bad writing, they tried, of course, come up with headcanon to try to be like, no, this is why he's acting this way, because there's like some technical device jargon on the on the sword that's causing him to do that. No. See, here's the thing. That never even occurred to me. Like, that thought never even entered my mind, because I knew what the writers were getting at. They were doing a very typical, stereotypical Gold Fever storyline. So this is that movie, The Treasure of Sierra Madrid. I believe that's what it's called. Which Ira Steven Behr stated that the episode is like. Now, I haven't found any direct quotes, to be fair. Yes, Treasure of Sierra Madrid. Yep, that's the name of it. But I haven't found any direct quotes, to be fair, that this episode was directly inspired by it, but I think it was pretty freaking obvious. Now, if you've never seen The Treasure of Sierra Madrid, I saw this for the first time when I was in college, and I was doing a course on film, and we had one of the modules of the course was about westerns, so I went back and watched all these westerns I'd never seen, because I've never been a fan of westerns. If you know my channel, I've said this many times before, but I watched movies I'd never seen before, and The Treasure of Sierra Madrid was 50s, I think it was black and white. It's a Humphrey Bogart film. And when I watched it, I was like, I have seen this film at least 15, maybe 20 times before, even though I never actually saw that film. To be clear, I never saw that movie before, but I saw iterations of that movie dozens of times, maybe even more than 20 times. Like, I was thinking of stuff like DuckTales and all these. It was actually amazing. A lot of the classic movies I went back and watched, it made me realize that a lot of the cartoons that I used to watch in the 80s were just aping. Like, some of the episodes would just directly rip off these classic films, and of course as little kids we had no idea because we've never seen these classic films. But yeah, this Gold Fever storyline, I can think of one episode in particular, DuckTales, that was like this. But it was more than that, like, because I've seen this, I was probably also thinking of this episode and many others, like but I think it's okay to do a Gold Fever storyline if you do an original spin on it, like you make it different enough to sort of justify its existence. Like, for example, Squid Game season 1 was basically a Gold Fever storyline because it was about everyone willing to kill each other over the prize money, but it made it different enough, like, and it made more of a commentary on income inequality. But however, when Squid Game Season 3 started to hammer home the Gold Fever storyline, I kind of held that against it. It was like, okay, we get it. You don't need to keep hammering home this Gold Fever storyline and keep doing it. And I suppose you could look at Lord of the Rings as a Gold Fever storyline, but the difference is, in that case, the item in question actually is magical and is driving. It's not just people are greedy over it, it's that the ring itself is making them be greedy with their magic. With its magic, it's designed that way. So I think that's why people were assuming the Sword of Kahless was the same way. Maybe they were just thinking of Lord of the Rings or something like that. But no, it's, and I could tell, like, the thought never even occurred to me, because it's very clear from the episode itself that it's just a sword. Like, if it was some technical thing or some, like, telepathic thing, they would have said it in the episode, which is why, these fans were just fansplaining. They were just in their minds trying to justify why Worf is so out of character, and they weren't willing to admit to themselves that it's just bad writing. And I'm sorry, that's just frankly just what it is. I recognized that right away for what it was, bad writing. Now, so the Gold Fever storyline is Worf and Core deciding to, like, going to try to kill each other, and it was just driving it home. That's why I thought the second half of the episode was boring, because it was just doing your typical cliche Gold Fever storyline without adding anything new to it, and plus it felt very contrived because Worf was out of character. Worf was acting 100% out of character. I did not buy that Worf would be like, I should rule the Empire and blah blah. Pfft, bullshit. No, bullshit. Like, Core, maybe a little bit, but even so, like, the way he was described at the beginning of the episode of really warming up to Worf right away and hating Gowron and whatever, it's like, and then all of a sudden he's like, oh, Worf, you're not really a Klingon, you don't deserve this, I should have it, ha 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 ha. Even that was maybe not as egregious as what happened with Worf, but it was still inconsistent with the start of the episode, and it's because they wanted to do a stupid Gold Fever storyline. And I gotta be honest, had they explained there was some telepathic thing or device causing them to do that, actually would have made the episode better. But I'm not going to headcanon it and try to pretend that's what they intended, where very clearly it's not. So as I said, there's TNG references. I'm not going to say this is the only time the episode The Rightful Heir was referenced, but it's definitely the biggest time. where they reference it the most heavily, because I believe like there's a line of dialogue, like a blink and you miss it kind of line of dialogue in The Way of the Warrior, where they mention Emperor Kahless. Outside of that, unless it's again very subtle, small references like that, outside of that, I don't believe he's ever really mentioned or referenced again. But in this episode, they talk about like, giving the sword to the Emperor. So talking about Emperor Kahless, and then Kor mentions that he's just some clone, and a clone that Worf helped put into power. So again, a lot of callbacks to the rightful heir. Which, I appreciate continuity, but again, it makes this episode feel more like a TNG episode, and is referencing TNG so heavily. And also, it's like, I don't really care about that episode. I don't know. I don't know. And the fact that they never mention Kahless ever again, as I talked about when I reviewed that episode, it just rendered it kind of pointless, and that Kahless. And you know what? Corbring has a very good point in this episode when he mentions, like, Kahless wasn't able to stop the invasion of Cardassia, even though he was against it, so what use is he? I think he kind of has a point there, actually, that he is kind of useless. But, and then they have Tyrell from Redemption Part 2. I did talk about that when I reviewed that episode as well. As, he came back here kind of proving that Worf was stupid for not killing him. And I talked about how I hated that ending of Redemption Part 2 when I think it was totally out of character for Worf to be like, no, I will not kill. It's that cliche that I fucking hate in TV when the good guy, the hero, has to be like, no, I will not kill. And it's usually like after they kill a whole bunch of minions in battle, and but when they go up to the bad guy and he's on his knees and defenseless, they're like, no, I'm better than that. You just killed like 50 people. Like Worf killed tons of people in that war in Redemption, and he's trying to be like, no, I'm a good person, I will not. Bullshit. I hate that. And so I'm kind of glad that Tyrell came back and screwed them because of him. Because he should have fucking killed him. And that's another point where I think Kor has a point. But that being said, the whole, let's kill Worf. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention is probably the biggest thing that Worf was out of character. That's outrageously out of character is when he actually tried to kill Kor. When Kor was hanging from the ledge, and he was like, drop the sword and fall. There's a ledge, and of course Kor refused to do it. And then after they lifted him up, even Dax looked at it and says, "That's not really a ledge. That ledge would never hold him." And Worf's like, "Well, if he died, that would be his own fault for being old and feeble." Like, come on. I don't give a shit over this, how much fucking Worf is being affected by this gold fever, which I still think the whole thing is bullshit. Worf would never do that. Like, just flat out would never do that. And that's another reason why I think people were so convinced that it was not telepathic, but like a technical device, like a technobabble reason why he was doing this. Because Worf would never fucking do that. Just period, point blank, end of story. Flat out. Worf would never do that. That is so outrageously out of character. I don't give a shit about any gold fever coming from the Sword of Kahless. And I've also heard people make analogies like Indiana Jones, maybe in the Last Crusade where they're looking for the Holy Grail or whatever, and apparently that was the original intention of this episode, was to be more like an Indiana Jones adventure, and apparently there were a lot more Indiana Jones-esque like traps and booby traps and more of a battle with Tyrell trying to kill them, and apparently they had to scrap most of those, apparently not necessarily for budget, but for time, because apparently doing all those elaborate scenes would add another filming day which of course the studio higher ups deemed unacceptable, so they had to cut most of those things. But I'm not entirely sure that would make this episode better. Maybe a little bit. It might be a bit more interesting, because most of the episode, especially the second half, which, as I said, is easily the worst, they were just wandering through the typical cave set. It made me think of that Lower Decks episode, Caves. I remember when I first reviewed that episode, I was like, trying to think all the time Star Trek went to caves, and I can't think of that many. But as I've been going through the episodes, I've been noticing a lot more that just didn't come to mind. And this is another one where they're in that very typical cliche cave set, is wandering around, and it's so boring. And it's just filled with, Worf and Core having their gold fever, which is incredibly out of character for them. And then, after Dax shoots them both, they beam up to the runabout, and off screen they've suddenly snapped out of it, and they decided it's better to just beam the sword into space. Really? Really? You're gonna do that? You're gonna have them off screen, just suddenly snap out of the gold fever for no good fucking reason? What the hell is that? Anyway, so there's the Lethian. I think this is only the second time. I mean, we could see Lethians in the background, but I think this is the only time that Lethian will feature prominently in an episode. First was that crappy episode, Distant Voices, where that Lethian was totally useless. And this Lethian was a bit better, to be fair. He managed to get the information out of Core. But you notice whenever the fights break out, the Lethian was always fighting Dax. I guess they had to have Klingon on Klingon violence, and so the non-Klingons had to fight amongst each other. But anyway, I think if I remember correctly, he did die. I don't think Terrell did, though. He could have come back, but he didn't, which is probably smart, because I don't give a shit about this character. But yeah, the sword itself, just looks like a very fancy batleth. And if you're going from making a comparison to Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, the whole point was the thing that they were looking for, the Holy Grail or whatever, was just an ordinary wooden cup, because because Jesus was an ordinary man. He wasn't into the rich enveloped things or whatever. So this episode goes against that, because Klingon Jesus, shouldn't he have a more humble looking batleth as well? But no. I guess you can say Kahless is different, but yeah, it does make him seem a bit even different than what, just judging Kahless from how he was portrayed in Rightful Heir. He does seem a lot more humble. It does seem like he wouldn't have a big, overly fancy looking batleth. I don't know. That is just me there. And who the fuck cares about it just because it's some ancient sword? I mean, I understand that it has spiritual and cultural meaning to the Klingons, but I don't buy that they would go as far to be so act like it can shape the whole entire empire. I don't know. I'm just not buying it. But anyway, I would now like to thank my Patreon supporters very much for supporting me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. Does help me continue with the channel. I'd like to give a big special thanks to Brandon Neilhouse and Jordan Johnson. Thank you so much for your strong support. I'd also like to give a shout out to Tyler Cease, Benjamin Mead, Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Miguelcio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we do have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, we have little Doras, baby Lethian, paranoid Worf, and a grumpy core, and what do we get? Elder Dax telling horror stories around a campfire. I wish we got instead a mind control sword from the asylum. Worf kept seeing his burden of son, Alexander, instead of Core. Core kept seeing his blood wine run away. Maybe when the mind control sword was turned off. Worf went back to save a dying Tyrell because he feels guilty about killing his daddies and his aunties. So my rating is 3. Klingons should have called should have called Blood Wine a different name, Death Blood or Blood Bath. That is a great death metal band from Sweden out of 10. Yeah, again, I mean, would it have been better if it was a mind control sword? Yes, I think it would have, but I still wouldn't like it, to be honest. It would still just be cliche Gold Fever storyline, even if it was mind control. It would at least explain why Worf is so incredibly out of character. So there's that. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, I like the first part of the episode. In my opinion, John Collins, not Collins, is Kalikos, I believe. John Kalikos did a great acting job, and the quest for the Klingon Holy Grail was a nice concept. The disruption between Core and Worf in the middle of the episode came very suddenly, and the whole concept felt very cliche. First fighting for the artifact, then realizing its power, it's too powerful, and in the end, destroying it, beaming it into the vastness of space is like destroying it to me. So the whole second half of the episode is much weaker, and it's boring to watch the characters walking through the old cave set again. A lot of questions about the Herc remained unanswered. Did they use the wormhole to get to the Alpha Beta Quadrant, or did they have some sort of trance warp, or did they really fly a couple of decades just to plunder a planet? I have a hard time believing that there is a Vulcan mining expedition in the Gamma Quadrant after the events of last year. It seems much too dangerous, and there are certainly enough planets in the Alpha/Beta Quadrant that can be mined much more savely. The first half would get an 8, but the second half brings it down to a 5 out of 10. Yeah, I don't really buy the whole thing with the Herc either. That was kind of just, I don't know, throwaway thing to try to make this episode happen. They were never mentioned ever before. I mean, it's an interesting concept, but it seems not fleshed out at all to me. But it's a good point as to how they got from the Gamma Quadrant to the Klingon homeworld. And it did make me think of like these Voyager episodes I just watched, like the 37s or Tattoo, that's implying these aliens came all the way from the Delta Quadrant to the Alpha Quadrant. And in the case of 37, yeah, both cases actually, and back again. And that's dumb, and I called it out for being dumb when I reviewed those episodes, but this is just as bad. Like, they wouldn't know about the wormhole. Like, they made it very clear that nobody knew about the wormhole for millennia. So how would the Herc know? So how the fuck did they get back to the Gamma? I don't know. And isn't it such serendipity, especially if they didn't know the wormhole, that they just happened to go to a planet that's accessible through the wormhole? I don't know. Yeah, the whole thing it bothers me just as much as those Voyager episodes did. Anyway, next comment is from Kyrie091, who says, the Sword of Kahless, more like, Mark, my credit card got locked, so I didn't even notice I had stopped paying and therefore wasn't getting notifications to add comments. My bad, but I've got that fixed. Wait, I mean more like Tour of Payless. You know, the old shoe store. This episode was about as exciting as taking a tour of that place. Which is to say, I really like it. I enjoy the episode, and I enjoy touring old shoe stores. Don't fucking judge me. Alright, I won't judge you. And I was wondering, I thought that you left us, Kyrie091, because I hadn't seen you in a while. And but yeah, no, that explains it. It's great to have you back. And I remember Payless shoes. Was once invited to a protest of it because apparently a spokesperson for Payless, or a celebrity that they were using in the commercials, said something that was very against atheists, and so this atheist group I knew was like, oh, come protest the shoe store. I'm like, I got better things to do with my time than this. I want to protest something, it would be something meaningful like the Iraq War. I gotta protest the fucking shoe store. But anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, this episode just plain never worked for me. It seemed when they brought back Worf for a while, Worf episodes were on their own, separate from the series. In this one, at least, Dax's friendship with Kor from Blood Oath provides a thread. But you have no idea how quick I forget the return of the little brat. Will someone please silence this child? Of redemption. Well, now a teenager and still intolerable. Glad of the return of a Lethian, but for such an interesting alien, boy does he show up in episodes that, well, suck. And that's what I'm getting at. This Gold Fever episode is just plain bad, and of course it's never explained whether or not the sword had powers that affected Worf and Kor, maybe from the Herc that was deliberately affecting those that are a Klingon species, or whether it was pure psychological. Either way, it's slow, I find it boorish, and at the end I just shrug my shoulders and don't think much of the continuation of Worf. Can't he be better integrated with the team ensemble while trying to continue Worf lore? Warning, I have a similar negative issue when Kern comes up later this season. I will give it 3 swords out of 10. I also have a similar negative feeling when Kern shows up, but yeah, I'll get to that too. I think I will disagree with you on one thing. I think it is explained whether or not this was magical or psychological, and is explained as being psychological by the simple fact that they never mention anything magical or mention any technology. I think that does, for me anyway, when I watched it, I totally got that they were trying to say that they were just being driven mad by greed. And there was no actual, like, external, magical, or technological force. Because how else would you portray that? Like, if you were trying to portray that, I think you would do exactly what they did, basically. And that's just have them act out totally out of character for no good goddamn reason. Fuckers. Anyway, next comment is from Benjamin Mead, who says, this episode sucks. I like a good quest, but this isn't it, especially after the sword turns the boys crazy. This would be a good contender for top character assassination, as one constant is that Worf doesn't put personal glory over honor or doing the right thing. I used to play this game called Star Trek Armada on a PC where you could play as the major faction, Starfleet, Klingons, Romulans, Borg, and build your fleet and do missions. One story was Worf commanding the Defiant, and you had to go back and find the Sword of Kahless because Tyrell was trying to take over the Empire again. It was a fun game. Yeah, I never really been into those video games myself. A lot of people mention Star Trek Online all the time, and some of the storylines sound somewhat interesting, but also a little fan fiction-y. And that does too, actually. It does sound a little fan fiction-y. Yeah, it's odd to hear you just flat out say this episode sucks. I guess, I don't know. I thought I was reading Ricky's comment at first, because he will just flat out say this episode's crap. Of course, I say that too. But anyway, yeah, it's an interesting point about it being contender for character assassination. I can't remember what I actually did for Worf. Was it the Let He Who Is Without Sin? I think maybe I chose that for his character assassination. But no, this is definitely, in some ways, is worse. Because he does defy his character. As you mentioned, he's always been one who would put honor in doing the right thing above his own personal glory. That's absolutely correct. Nailed it 100%. Couldn't agree with you more. So maybe you're right. Maybe this should have been a top contender for character assassination. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, this episode is such a lesser quality of a Klingon in a Season 4 episode. To me, this is one of the most boring and the least interesting episodes of the whole show. I don't give a shit about the sword or about Duras's son. What a waste. And the biggest thing that annoyed me is that Worf and his mentor fighting for the sword, and then Dax shoots them, and then all of a sudden they somehow agree off screen to beam the sword into space because people aren't ready. I just don't like this, so 2 out of 10 for me. So I could imagine like the pitch meeting, if Ryan George did it, he would say something like, the writer guy would be like, when they beam back to the runabout, they decide to beam the sword into space. And producer guy would ask, so what made them change their mind? Because they were, just a few seconds ago, they were willing to kill each other over the sword, over gaining the power. How they changed their mind? And the writer guy would answer, by being off screen. Jesus Christ. Yeah, so I hadn't really mentioned that the Klingon aspect of it. I talked about how I really don't like Klingon episodes of Season 4 because the Klingons they're being the bad guys. I really hate it. But to be fair, this episode actually could exist outside of that realm. I mean, there's a whole thing about Worf being dishonored or whatever, which again I think is fucking repetitive and I hate it. But other than that, like, it's mainly just like Duras's, and they're always enemies anyway, so that's fine. So it doesn't really fall in the category of episodes that piss me off because the Klingons are the villains. But we will get there shortly. Don't you worry. Anyway, thank you, patrons, so much for your comments. So my rating for the Sword of Kahless shoes, sorry. Shout out to Kyrie. Anyway, my rating for the Sword of Kahless out of 10 is going to be a 4 poor, and I actually think I'm being generous by giving this episode a 4. I think it probably deserves lower, but I don't know. I just, when I think of episodes, it just to me is more of a throwaway rather than, this episode is complete crap and it sucks and so I don't really have that ire towards this episode. It's just something that I think is very forgettable. I guess I appreciate, because I do agree that John Calicos, however you say his name, does a good job, and I do like some of the interactions. As I said, the first half of the episode is actually good. I'm actually interested in Worf meeting Calicos and the interactions that Dax has. It's just when they go into the Gold Fever storyline where the whole thing goes off a cliff. So I think there is some redeemable values to this episode. It's just, definitely deserves a poor rating for sure. Anyway, that is it for my review of the Sword of Kahless. If you enjoyed this review, please be sure to leave a like, subscribe, that sort of thing helps me a lot. in the algorithm. And if you'd really would like to support the channel, you could do so by supporting me on Patreon. It's a link in the description below. Different rewards such as pre-releases, you can make comments on videos that I do, and a patron-only series of videos I do exclusively for my Patreon supporters, where I will revisit reviews that I've already made. Alright, so let's see what's coming up on my channel. Let's find where I'm at. Okay, so Monday will be my review of the Voyager episode Maneuvers. Wednesday I'll be doing a patron requested video of the top 10 worst Star Trek villains. And then on Thursday we'll be reviewing the newest episode of Strange New Worlds Season 3 Episode 5. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager and many other videos on Star Trek and other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.